And hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and thank you very much for tuning in and or watching the replay if you are of this show we're doing with Harley Schlanger live today on May the 9th, 2023. It's a little after 11 on Tuesday morning here on the west coast of the U.S. in my little humble studio we call Mystery Island Studio. And it's great to have Harley Schlanger joining us once again from Potsdam, Germany. And I still am amazed at how well we can communicate across so many miles. It's just terrific. So thanks again, Harley, for making time for us here at McDuff Lives, and welcome.
Well, and it's especially important as today is a special day to commemorate. The May 9th is the Victory in Europe Day, the day the Nazis were defeated. In the West, they sometimes celebrate it on the 10th, but the war ended late on the day of the 9th in Russia time. So that's why the Russians always celebrate it on May 9th.
Well, we used to acknowledge it. I mean, VE Day was a minor not federal holiday, but something that we acknowledged in our, like in school, it's today's VE Day.
Yeah.
And, you have the classic pictures of the handshake across the Rhine and the beautiful, just the celebrations, the happiness of people at the end of the greatest and worst conflict in history. That joy is something that people really, I mean, you can even see some people on YouTube's and get a sense of what a relief it was after 6, 7, 8 years of disastrous war. So the Victory Day in Europe is something that should have brought Russia and the United States together to celebrate a job well done. And yet it seems that the American side has become deaf to the sacrifices of the Russians and deaf to the historical moment that we are passing through here because of its headlong commitment to the war in Ukraine, and what most of us that observe it would concede or admit is really an attack on Russia itself, a destabilization in an attempt to bring that state to heel under our financial system, that we always refer to here on the show as the City of London Wall Street financial system. But
Oh,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that the famous speech John Kennedy gave at American University in June 1963, he spoke quite eloquently about the Russian sacrifice in World War II. And he said, no country paid a greater price to defeat the Nazis than did the Russians. And we should remember that when we deal with the Soviet Union, that they lost, and I don't know if he used the figure, but now the figure generally accepted is between 25 and 27 million people died as a result of the Nazi invasion and the fight that the Soviet army waged against them. And had it not been for the Soviet army, Hitler might have been able to conquer the West, because it was the breaking of Hitler's forces on the East which made it much more easy for the Western Front to succeed. Now, the irony, as you point out, is that this used to be an important day. I remember when I was in grade school that we talked about it, and some of us brought our parents in. My father served in Europe during World War II, and he was one of the group of parents that came in to talk to the class about being in Europe. But now it's because of the alliance we have with Ukraine. We're not supposed to bring up the Nazis. Why? Because there are Nazis in the Ukrainian government. We're arming them. The Germans are arming them. The US and the British are arming them. And the event of last week with the drone attack on the Kremlin, Yaрошenko, one of the leaders of the Interior Ministry of Ukraine, said this should be a warning to the Russians that there may be drones that hit their victory parade in Moscow. Now, why would they not want to celebrate victory over the Nazis? Well, it's obvious. despite the denial that there are Nazis in the Ukrainian military and security services, there are. There are many streets and avenues and parks named after Stefan Bandera, who was the Nazi-era collaborator with the Ukraine Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists that not only supported the Nazis, but integrated themselves into the Galician SS. So that's why it's a controversial day. In Germany, you can imagine that there wouldn't be a great deal of celebration because it was the defeat of the Germans, but at least the Germans used to recognize it. They actually tried to pass a law that would not allow the waving of a Russian flag at the Russian memorial just across the Brandenburg Tor, the Brandenburg Gate, because of the war in Ukraine. And the federal courts in Germany overruled that and said you could bring a Russian flag. But you can see how controversial it is because of the present wartime alignment against Russia.
Yes, and I've been content to allow our financial system some credit for not being Nazis themselves, but they find it useful to use these armies that are committed to this ideology that they're going to kill Slavs. They're going to kill Russians, and this ideology that they have is useful to the financial system, but it doesn't mean that the financial system itself is consisted of these Nazis, except for when you go back and you think, now, wait a minute, who was this Galician SS division and what happened to them after World War II? And this is one of the things that I discovered when I was really starting my research, and it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, that the British government took the Galician division and divided it among the Commonwealth countries, giving them, secret new identities, etc. But this is one of the bases of the Gladio system that was seeded at that time. Now, I could imagine that if for some overriding political reason to settle things at the end of World War II, that the British might have said, well, we'll secretly cover for you, we'll take care of these guys, and we'll stick them in communities, and they'll just turn into ordinary British people. And that's a fantasy that I entertained for a little while until I started to read more and more and more. And then you learn about these stay-behind armies, and you learn about the Gladio program, and then you learn about these illegals that are brought into the United States from Eastern Europe. This is where you get your Bandera, you get your these ethnic power centers in Chicago and other cities. That really did happen, and of course, Christopher Simpson's great book Blowback documents it very, very well. This is not something we can just turn aside from anymore. The alliance between that financial system and this Nazi philosophy and these people that are used by it is a lot more than simply, they're useful people. This is a deep philosophical and moral problem that exists in the financial system itself, in my opinion. What do you think?
Well, I'll get to the financial system in a second, but let me just mention what you were talking about in the incorporation of Nazis and Nazi supporters into the West. The Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, her grandfather was the editor of the Nazi newspaper that was in Galicia that called for the pogroms against Jews, Russians, Romanians, and Hungarians in Ukraine. And Bandera's group is responsible for anywhere between 80 and 140,000 murders. Now, she still speaks of Bandera as a patriot. And she's the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, who at points has been mooted as the next head of NATO. So when you talk about the incorporation of these Nazi networks. Reinhard Gehlen, who ran Hitler's Eastern intelligence units, was essentially brought in by the United States and was established in West Germany as a spy master. And a lot of the networks that he brought with them became part of the Gladio crowd. So that's definitely a part of history that they're trying to whitewash or write off. Now, on the finance side, there are a number of books, such as one called Trading with the Enemy, a number of others. We did a book, The Unauthorized Biography of George H.W. Bush, that went through extensively documented research that was done by two of my associates into the role of New York financiers in putting Hitler in power. And the two names are very familiar names. Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush and grandfather of George W., and Roland Harriman, the brother of Averell Harriman. And the two of them were on a bank board called the Union Bank Corporation of New York. Besides our work, Kevin Phillips has documented this. But was there ever any investigation into this by the United States? They were laundering money through the Thyssen network, Thyssen Steel, Fritz Thyssen, that went to Hitler in the 1930s. The bank was seized by FDR's Justice Department in 1942, after we'd already been at war with Germany for about 9 or 10 months, seized under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And yet, none of this ever came up when George H.W. Bush ran for president. So, and there's much more on this, the so-called trusts, the steel trust, the chemical trust, the rubber trust, the pharmaceutical trusts. These were corporate entities that were corporations that included Germans and Americans and Brits who were involved in funding the Nazi war buildup. So this is just real history. The problem is you're not taught real history anymore. And people in the United States have this idea, somewhat shaped, for my generation, was somewhat shaped by the program Hogan's Heroes, where the Nazis were portrayed as somewhat bungling, lovable characters like Sergeant Schultz. I know nothing. You remember that, John?
How can you forget?
And so, this idea
How can you
that
forget that the acting is beautiful? Yeah. I mean, and then, of course, well, let's not even talk about Robert Crane's secret obsessions. The star of the show.
Good point.
A weird show, and it's consonant with the efforts of that great filmmaker to Hitler in Germany, the comic filmmaker.
Charlie Chaplin?
No, the Jewish guy.
No.
Reiner, Carl Reiner, the one that made the producers.
Oh, Carl Reiner. Yeah.
Carl
Yeah.
Reiner, and then the springtime for
Springtime for Hitler.
But you know what they have, and then this is one of my other big things that I talk about. I noticed that they put in a new name to cover up a name that they don't want you to look at, like the rock and roll band called the Foo Fighters, because they don't want you to look at the Foo Fighters from World War II that were the mysterious plasma type things that the fighter planes were encountering. They want you to consider that. Well, this is Spike Jones. Spike Jones in the City Slickers was one of the most wonderful comic and superb musicians that we ever had. And the imposition of a new Spike Jones into the public consciousness, I think it came out in the 80s, this Spike Jones guy. And he got all, of course, makes the $1 million and everything. I don't know anything about him except for I resent that they keep doing that, taking away people's ability to locate something important. And the reason that I especially raise that now is because I look at Carl Reiner's work as a way to cover up the brilliant comic song of In the Fuhrer's Face, Beneficus feast the master race, the higher, higher, right in the Führer's face. And it just goes on and with his raspberries and everything. That's just terrific anti-fascist propaganda. Uh, all of that stuff gets covered up. Of course, Woody Guthrie's guitar had a sign on it that said, "This machine kills fascists." Well,
Yeah.
all of that stuff, cultural stuff, we've all been under this incredible blanket of psychological control through the media and culture that is, as every time I pull aside a layer, I'm going, oh no, don't tell me, the Beatles, no, no, I don't, not the Beatles. I love the Beatles. I can give you the Rolling Stones. That's not a problem for me.
Yeah, the Rolling Stones. Mick Jagger, don't forget, was a graduate of the London School of Economics.
I didn't know
Yeah.
that. Well,
And of course,
he may say,
if you want to talk about parodies, I assume you at least saw some coverage of the coronation this last weekend. I mean, I talked about it in my Monday update. If you look at the pictures of Charles and Camilla, it looks as though they're miserable. And it also looks as though the crowns are too big for their head. And someone wrote that, well, they were too big for their heads. And I said, well, maybe their heads are just too small for the crowns. But the idea that $150 to $200 million were spent on that coronation, which was state money, at a point in which you can't pay doctors, the hospitals are overcrowded, and you can't get ambulances in London. And yet they have this commemoration of the so-called tradition, the pomp and circumstances of the British Empire. And what was the British Empire about? It was a brutal killing machine, a looting machine. Excuse me, I'm fighting the pollen.
yeah, understood. It's pretty heavy over here this year too. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, but we're having a beautiful spring here. Marcia and I, we just got back from a week at the beach, and a little chilly but beautiful, and to get down there before the tourists all show up, or so it was really restful. So anyway, and you had to, and thank you for rescheduling to today so we could get away. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Hey, I don't want to let the show go by without asking a question or two about the economy now, and I guess we should cover what Janet Yellen just said, that the Treasury Department is going to have to absolutely raise. They're going to have to raise the debt limit. Congress, the ball's in your court. And of course, for those who are not aware, we're facing another one of those, cliffhanger moments.
Cliffhangers, yeah.
And but nobody cares about it anymore. Nobody knows. But it is possible that the United States could actually default. And if it does, isn't that going to trigger a whole lot of bad stuff?
Well, if you listen to the Republicans, they're saying the reason we have to have a cliffhanger is because the Democrats don't want to cut spending enough. And so that's the reason why there's a cliffhanger coming up, that there's too much spending. Now, do they ever say too much spending on the war in Ukraine? You want to save $100 billion? Stop funding the Nazi regime in Kiev and stop pushing for World War III. But that doesn't come up. And what they want to do is they want to blame it on illegal aliens and welfare cheats and so on, the old profiles from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the real reason there's a crisis, and by the way, the bigger crisis right now than the debt ceiling is the banking situation. There was just a report done by a Stanford University banking expert that was published in the Daily Telegraph yesterday, who pointed out that almost half of the banks in the United States are technically insolvent. That is, their total value of their assets doesn't even cover anywhere near their liabilities, which is a technical sign of what it means to be bankrupt. That is, if they had to call a margin call, or if they had to come up with money and tried to sell off their assets to raise the money to pay it, they couldn't do it. And this is, of course, why back in September 2019, we had the repo crisis, because many debtors didn't have enough money to meet the interest on their debt, and the banks weren't going to loan them anymore. So the Fed had to step in September 2019. And what did the Fed do? Just pump money into the system, trillions of dollars. And that's a major cause for inflation, because the money was not going into production, not going into anything real, going in to cover the bad debt of the clients of the banks to keep the banks solvent. So the banks weren't solvent, they were liquid. And there's a difference between liquidity and solvency. You can pour money into something like crazy, which is what the Fed has been doing, but that doesn't make it solvent. And so the banks are in a situation where they're having to sell off the treasuries and other bonds they have at the interest rates that were lower from the previous period, and then borrow money at the higher rates to pay it. That's why banks are in trouble. But it means there's going to be a credit crunch, which will make things worse, because small and medium-sized businesses will be cut off from access to credit. So that's what this banking professor was talking about. Half the banks could go under. And if that happens, you're going to have a domino effect, because those banks are also connected to some of the so-called too big to fail banks. Now, a too big to fail bank to bail out, like Credit Suisse, the bailout of Credit Suisse is more than the GDP of Switzerland. So how do you do that? Well, austerity, wartime austerity. And that's how the war partly fits into this whole picture.
A psychological way to explain why we're going into austerity is because we have to defeat the enemy without, the exterior enemy.
Yeah.
The old Roman idea. Wow. I've been thinking and working and reading through some articles and on this issue of what is neoliberalism. And I imagine there's different definitions of it, but what's happening as I read this stuff is I'm starting to believe that there is a great misconception on the part of conservative or right-wing thinkers that we say we want sovereignty, we want national sovereignty with individual rights in our nation, and the rest of the world can do whatever they want. But we want our nation, we want to control through our democratic republic our own destiny. But at the same time, as has been pointed out for at least since Marx, the economy is not confined within any one country. It's a world economy. So if there's a world economy, how much effect can the laws of a sovereign state have upon the lives of the people? When what's really important, as you've just been pointing out, is credit, is accessibility of money that you can invest into productive activities that will increase your standard of living and give us that American dream we all want. How is it possible? For instance, have I shown you my glass seagull?
Yeah.
This is my glass seagull. How can we have a worldwide glass seagull, I mean, or as we were talking about last time we were together, it's got to be a worldwide effort to reform the worldwide financial system. But if you do that, if you create a body that is going to be able to control and set limits on what happens within that worldwide financial system, you're giving up a great deal of that sovereignty that you want so bad. So the point of what I was reading was that at a certain time, the people that wanted that totalitarian government came to a realization that no, you don't really want to do that. You just want to have the separation between the economy and then the sovereign states that are still, pursuing their sovereign goals, whether it be, democracy or socialism or some capitalism, whatever they're pursuing, doesn't matter because we control the economy. And that's what I think has really been going on. Is just the creation of the separation of us fools from our money, as P.T. Barnum would have put it. And that separation of control over the financial system from the sovereign governments, such as we would like to have in this country, is a paradox that I really don't know how to see through it. Are we not going to be giving up sovereignty if we create a world system of economic control?
Well, you don't want a world system of economic control. That's what the Great Reset is. That hands to the central bankers all the power over currency, credit, debt, and spending.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the Great Reset is about. Now, a sovereign nation sovereignty means you control your own credit system. You have a currency system. But as you point out, I mean, LaRouche used to talk about the worldwide cup of coffee. How much of a division of labor for the whole world goes into producing and delivering a cup of coffee to you each morning? So there is a necessity for international trade. So what are the terms of the trade? Right now, they're totally controlled by Wall Street and London. And they will argue that other countries' currencies can be subject to the so-called market. This is what neoliberal means, that you don't have governments determining the rates. It's the market that determines the value of things. Well, we've seen how that works. George Soros can go into a country, borrow hundreds of millions of dollars in that currency, and then turn it in demanding dollars. And that country will, if it doesn't pay out in dollars, will be written off the credit system. And so that's how the sovereignty is undermined by the present system. Now, what we're proposing is multilateral agreements where you reach agreements on what's in the interest of each nation. And if a nation needs credit and it doesn't have the ability to generate it internally, you can help it. And you can help it without putting that country in hock to you forever. For example, what the Chinese are doing is they're loaning money at low interest rates to African countries to build power systems, dams and water control, and transportation. Now, the idea is that these will then be connected to local industries so that products will be produced, they can be shipped, they'll have the power to do it, they'll have the water system, the water management that's needed, and then they can make money. So they'll be able to eventually pay down the debt. Now, the West never allowed them to pay down the debt. They just kept loaning them more money, demanding that they cut their spending and then sell off their products cheaply to the West. The Chinese are trying to work it so that countries can make a profit from what they're doing. And that's in the interest both of the country that's the partner with them, as well as the Chinese. And so that's what mutual benefit or cooperation means. Now, you can have a system of sovereign states and do that. The question is, do you do it with dollars? Do you do it with yuan? Do you do it with rupees or rubles or whatever else? Now, that gets to a real part of the question, which is that the hardcore neoliberals, the Austrian school, say that credit should be limited to the amount of gold you have, and that way you can't spend too much. But it also means you can't invest in long-term projects without the problems we have with the International Monetary Fund. Now, if you have a floating exchange rate system, it means currency speculators will be able to game the system and destroy nations. So instead, if you have currencies that are backed by something, gold, oil, wheat, fertilizer, raw materials, which is what the BRICS are talking about, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa alliance, then you can do it, because then you have these countries are borrowing to build things that will give them the means to pay it back. And you have to have decent terms for them to do that. It won't be overnight profits. But in that way, the benefit of both or multiple countries is taken into consideration rather than the benefit of the lender. And so, we're talking about multilateral agreements, such as the discussion now, what the Chinese are proposing with the Belt and Road Initiative, what the Russians are doing to finance nuclear plants in some African countries. The Russians and the Chinese have been forgiving debts. When was the last time Wall Street or City of London forgave debts to a country that couldn't pay? Instead, they made them sign agreements to turn over everything, including their firstborn, to pay off the debt. And I'm only slightly exaggerating about turning over the firstborn. The Economic Hitmen book, which many of your viewers know, goes through details how these bankers use these terms to put countries completely under control of the international banks. So the question is, how do you break out from under this banker's dictatorship? And the only way is when you have multilateral agreements that will allow for countries to develop. Now, if a country is run by completely crazy people who borrow money and then fritter it away or steal it, then you stop lending to them at a certain point. You may have to provide backup to their people. But what the IMF does is they keep lending and they just impose harsher conditionalities and steal more from those countries. So this is where, in a sense, the quality of mercy, the principle, the biblical principle of I am my neighbor's keeper. This is the whole idea of the Peace of Westphalia. We're all in it together. Let's work together to do it. Instead, the West is saying, if you don't do what we say, we'll have a coup. We'll have a regime change. We'll fund terrorists against you. We'll go to war against you. And so there are two completely different moral principles here. One is a principle that's might makes right, and the other one is the principle that it's the benefit of the other, which is what I should be working towards. And that will come back to me many times over. So in a sense, it's a biblical fight, John.
A biblical fight over a financial system.
Yeah.
I think that Jesus's financial system was kind of like, let's all just sit around together and share what we have, and have a nice meal together. Nobody in Jesus's time had any money, unless you were the emperor or the king or something. But that idea of share and share alike is very much part of what I think is my own belief, and that is essentially the golden rule. And that if we can follow,
and here's where you see where the neoliberals come in, and they say, well, but then what you're doing is you're blunting individual initiative to get rich. And it's the individual initiative to get rich which drives the economy. Well, that's not true. That's what drives empires. But in fact, the modern examples of Western economies that have grown have been based on this idea of the benefit of the other. And this is what the British don't want to have replace the current system. For example, from the 1880s to the present, the British had the greatest fear that German industry, science, and technology could link up with Russian raw materials and population that would benefit both nations and would take power away from the British to manipulate trade. That's what geopolitics is all about. How do you keep Russia and Germany against each other? And if you can pull France in on your side against Germany, even better. That's what led to World War I. That's what was going on at Versailles. That's with the Versailles Treaty, which made sure that Germany was weakened by the West to the extent that Germany ended up going into chaos. And then it was easy to impose a dictator in Germany who would say, well, we're going to pay off those people who stole from us. Now we're seeing the same thing discussed with Ukraine right now. What would be the solution to the Ukraine war? Now, Josep Borrell, the foreign minister of the European Community, the various Brits, including Sir John Dearloffe, by the way, the former MI6 director who was just in Kiev after Zelensky and Xi had a talk. And what we're told, one of the things that Xi basically said is, look, you solve this war, you stop fighting, and we'll help you rebuild. Now, Zelensky instead has the attitude, no, we need payback. Russia has to pay. Russia has to be punished. Now, you're never going to get an agreement unless you destroy Russia, that the Russians will come in and say, okay, we'll pay back the damage that was done, because the Russians are saying you did damage to Russian people in the Donbass. So how do you get above this beggar thy neighbor mentality? You can only do it if you take the approach that Xi is taking, where he says economic cooperation is the solution. Now, how do we know that'll work? Well, there's progress between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And what was the basis of it? Rebuilding Syria, bringing Syria back into the acceptable grace of the Arab nations. Iran played a role in that. You know, this idea that by reconstruction, you build the whole region. Every nation gets stronger. All the efforts go toward not just eliminating poverty, but creating prosperous nations. Now, who's against that? Antony Blinken. He says this is not a solution. Who's against settling the Ukraine war? Blinken. The British, Sunak, and whatever Biden, whoever's inside Biden's head, is against a solution. So that's why I say you have two different attitudes that are really shaped by biblical principles. One of that is the idea of the empire, which the example of that is the Babylonian Empire, the Philistines, or so on, versus the mission of Jesus Christ, which is that all people should love each other and act with charity towards all. So I think that's really what should be the basis of economics, rather than how to get rich. And neoliberalism is about how to get rich. Greed is good. Greed drives the markets.
For the American system to work, there has to be goodwill, such as you speak of. Two big issues come to my mind. The first one was that if you do have sovereign control over the economy in the United States, then you are cutting out an awful lot of money that is already here, that's invested in this country, like Chinese money, Russian money, money from all over the world is in here, owning our real estate, our institutions, and parts of our corporations. It's all mixed up there. If we end up in some type of a stressful situation with one of those countries, they have a lot of influence over our financial system right now. How do we get out? How do we get their claws out of it? How do you get Tony Blinken out of the State Department? How do you get BlackRock out of Zelensky's pocket, or Zelensky out of BlackRock's pocket, I should say? And when you speak of the rhetoric from Kiev, I just think that's just an excuse. You know, it's just this that they're not ready to settle yet, and they're not going to be ready to settle until they're quite certain they've gotten every bit that they possibly can back from the Donbass and the area that Russians control now, and they don't care about the human cost, because this really is an imperial project, and there's where the problem is that empires by definition do not share Christian morality. They just don't. They can't. They cannot survive without a system of grinding down the poor, and it's occasionally eliminating them if there's too many of them. They can't survive, and they have to keep on with their genocidal, awful, terrible policies, because When it comes right down to it, they have no respect for Christianity. They have no respect for those of us that would turn the other cheek, and that's the way I look at it anyway. I don't see any way to convince them by virtue of agreements between sovereign countries that we're all now going to be nice to each other. I just don't see it. We're going to have to expose this empire and really tear it apart if we want to get to that goal that you speak of.
Well, you're not going to have a Rodney King moment where they say, can't we all just get along? The problem that you just identified is what LaRouche has always said is the central problem, the existence of empires and an imperial mindset.
Right.
And what's the imperial mindset? It's based on the idea that we're better than you. We're better genetically. This is why eugenics was such an important part of the Nazi movement. And if you really look at it, where did eugenics come from? It came from the British. It came from the idea of a monarchy that some people are born better. And then you have all this stupid rationalization. Well, we've been given so much, so we have to give more to you. We have to go and set up charities. And you look at this, and it makes you sick when you see what they do. There are reports that there were between 30 and 50 million Indians who died at the hands of the British Empire. Look at the Irish, what they had as a result of British colonialism. So it wasn't just for people who were of different colors. The Irish are at least somewhat genetically related to the Anglos, and yet they were exterminated by British policies. And precisely the British policies that we've been talking about, the imperial policies, the get rich at the expense of the poorer population. The Chinese experienced that. A top British official is now going to Hong Kong to say that we still care about the people of Hong Kong. Well, the British cared so much for the people of Hong Kong that they sent the British fleet twice in 1839 and again in 1859 to force opium smoking and opium purchases on the Chinese population. So this idea that the empire is beneficent and did so many good things and brought civilization to uncivilized countries. Helga made a funny comment the other day. Borrell, the foreign minister of the EU, talks about the Europe is a garden and the jungle is trying to get in and despoil the garden. And Helga said, well, maybe Borrell should go to the jungle, countries like in Africa and Asia, and see how civilized they actually are compared to the cutthroat policies that are underway in the European Union. And by the way, speaking of sovereignty, there's not a single sovereign government in Europe right now. And it's not because the EU exists as a higher order. It's that the EU is a collection agency for the City of London and the Brussels, Frankfurt banks. So, this idea that somehow there's a higher degree of civilization in Europe is a fraud. But I think the important thing, John, and if you look at the language being used about China, it's the old racism from the 19th century against the Chinese. Just as the racism against the African population was a part and a totally integrated part of European imperialism. So it's not that we should say that the West, therefore, is terrible and bad and racist. It's that there's a difference between a mutually beneficial approach to politics and we're going to show you how to get rich, which never, they may pick out a few people to get them rich. And those become the oligarchs from that country who rule on behalf of the imperial power. Now, I just want to give an example of that. There was a poll taken by a Ukrainian newspaper. I don't have the name in front of me. It's a Ukrainian news service. I think it's Union or something like that. It's owned by the oligarch Kolomoisky. And after the near assassination of this Russian novelist last week, they did a poll. of their readers. And the poll question, they put a list of Russian names and they said, who should be the next Russian who's eliminated? Now, this news service is partnered with BBC, with Voice of America, with Reuters. So here you have an unhinged Ukrainian oligarch who was the guy who actually bankrolled Zelensky's entry into politics, Kolomoisky, who besides being Ukrainian is also a Mossad agent. Here you have this guy who is working with all the so-called legitimate Western mainstream media, sending out a poll as to who should be killed. Now, that's why we identified the Committee to Combat Disinformation in Ukraine as part of a NATO operation to eliminate opposition. And I think that tells you something about when we talk about Nazis in Ukraine, we're not just talking about people with Hitler's symbols tattooed on their arms. We're talking about a certain mentality, which is that we have the right to exterminate people we don't like. And this includes the opposition to the music of Tchaikovsky. There was a very interesting development in Germany this week. Anna Netrebko, the soprano, the wonderful soprano who's Russian, who's been under sanctions because she's pro-Putin, was scheduled to sing in a performance of Nabucco, Verdi's opera, in Wiesbaden. And the town council and a bunch of other groups under pressure from Ukraine tried to cancel it. But the Schauspiel director, the person who runs the theater, said, no, it's against European law to discriminate against people because of their nationality. And so they went ahead and let Netrebko sing, and they had to schedule a second performance. They were both sold out. There were standing ovations. And this is how you counter the hate that goes into this Nazi approach, through culture, through beauty, through love. And sometimes that has to come from the force of arms. But that's the only way you can counter what otherwise becomes an ugly manifestation of an imperial greed that has no consideration for the legitimate rights of others.
Well, I think we're at that moment in considering, the anticipation of World War II, where, in the 30s, we gradually are seeing the pot boiling and, thinking, wow, it's these guys are really totalitarians. These guys are going to do terrible things, and then they start doing terrible things, and we see more and more terrible things, and then they steal this land, and then they start shipping these people off to death camps, and then at some point, the idea that we could stop them by cultural exchanges becomes kind of we're going to have to pick up the rifle here, guys, if we want to stop this thing. And we seem to be facing that kind of a problem right now, because those of us that understand the value of goodwill exchanges and negotiation are not winning right now. That is
well, except, John, much of the world is turning away from the imperial divisions. And that's the argument that's going on in the global south. Should there be any cooperation to save the dollar? And to me, one of the signs that we've moved into a new era was when the Saudis, who have existed under the thumb of the British since they became a nation in the 1920s, and under the American oil companies since the end of World War II, the Saudis have moved into a different environment, a different era. And they're not going along with this game anymore. So if the Saudis are able to break with this unipolar order, what about other countries? And I think that's the hope. Now, what we have to do, those of us who aren't ignorant and blind, is go to our fellow Americans and fellow Western Europeans and say to them, we're headed over the cliff. This is the Wile E. Coyote moment where you suddenly look down and you realize there's nothing between you and this fall off into a cliff. That's where we are. Do you want to keep going in the same direction, or can you stop and think? And it's up to us. And I think, John, what you do with your program is very important, because it's not preaching to people, it's showing people through history what happens when you ignore fundamental principles and just plow ahead based on power. And, if we reach a few people every day, get a few more people out on the street, I think at some point we have truth and reason on our side. That doesn't mean we'll succeed, but it's a very powerful thing to have behind you.
Yeah, this world economy is the control thing that troubles us the most. And we talk about the ancient wealth, the fondi of Italy, that gets transferred to Bank of London, and but the problem is that there is so much hidden wealth that can be applied by the empire to any problem that we might create for them. If it's like they can play whack-a-mole, right? I put my head up and I say, hey, we got to do this right now. And if they don't like that, whack, and I go
But
back.
what happens if there are more moles sticking their heads up than there are oligarchs with clubs?
Well,
Percy Shelley hit on this in his poem where he said, "We are many, they are few." And the problem is we don't realize that. People don't realize that the majority are suffering worldwide under this system. And if you have a few dollars in the bank and you have a nice car and you can pay your rent, you may be one firing away from being out on the street with all the others. And it's the conceit that people have that I'm different. I control my situation. That's the conceit that makes people susceptible to the lure of the neoliberal survival of the fittest mentality. And I think that's where the cultural question comes in. That's where great music, great poetry, great drama, where people can use their minds to reflect on what happened to the great empires of the past. Just going back to Shelley, his poem Ozymandias. You know that poem, John?
Remind me.
It's a beautiful poem about a guy who's walking in the desert and he sees a statue with the sand being blown over it. And on the statue it says, "Beware my visage, the great Ozymandias." And then it ends by saying, "All around him the barren sands were visible." The emperor at one moment is forgotten in history because of the evil that they've done that destroyed their civilization. And it's that use of poetry. I did a very bad rendition of it, but Ozymandias by Shelley is a beautiful poem about the conceit of empire. And it'd be well worthwhile people taking a few minutes to Google it and read it.
Yeah, I wish the show wasn't getting to the end, because I really would like to jump in a little bit more on this issue, because they get you so young. They say, hey, wouldn't you like to have a 30-year mortgage? Oh, you can have this house. If you just sign here 30-year mortgage. You can pay it off. Don't worry about it. And then you're on the treadmill, Harley. And then even if the best intentions in the world, once you got those two kids in the car in the garage, you're going to have to stay on the treadmill for those 30 years. And
what's happening today is that so many people are making the same mistake that a decade and a half ago they made. They think, well, I have a house, I'm paying the house, I'll be okay. I can always use the house as leverage if I have to borrow.
Right.
And all of a sudden, the value of homes are collapsing because people can't get mortgages to buy homes. So the idea that the house is the ultimate security is going out the window. Same thing, look, Bitcoin, gold, silver, these are controlled commodity markets. And the plug can be pulled on them at any time. And the only thing you have of security is a nation that functions, that acts for the interests of its population. We don't have that. Biden is not that president. Trump wasn't that kind of president. We haven't had a president who is remotely like that since John F. Kennedy. And, can we get that again? I'm watching Robert F. Kennedy right now. He's kind of interesting what he's saying. And it's also interesting how he's being frozen out by the Democratic Party and the media.
He said something about Bitcoin and alternate currencies that I thought was a little bit chilling, in that I am still one of those people that I think, the dollar is what we keep the dollar afloat. We as the American people, we invest in things in dollars, and we trust the dollar for our future. And if we started not trusting the dollar and started trusting something else that's controlled somewhere else, that we're going over that slippery slope very far. Nevertheless, he says that we should be able to trade in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And, I envision that as diluting the value of my tiny little 401k plan. So how do you see that? Is it okay to let these cryptocurrencies keep growing and diluting, or are they actually just not diluting at all, but maybe doing some kind of global good that I haven't seen yet?
Well, the cryptocurrency question is extremely complicated because it essentially became part of the speculative system. And the question then is, who makes the rules? Who controls it? And at least with a dollar system that works, if you have a backing of the dollar by something, whether it's gold reserve, whether it's physical product, but if you have a backing of something, then you have confidence that you can trade in that currency, or the ruble, or the yuan. But if you don't have that, then moving to another form of trading currencies is not a solution. So the real question remains, can you get a government that takes as its central purpose the general welfare of its population? And if you do, then you can hammer out ways to have an economy that will prosper for the benefit of all. If you don't have that view, it doesn't matter what form of money you have. Someone will figure out how to rig the system and steal it. What intrigues me most about Kennedy is his attacks on the idea of the corporate control of the state and identifying that as a key element of the Ukraine war. Because that's something you and I have talked about.
Well, when I think about Bobby Jr., it would be wonderful if I came to the point where I felt that I want to throw in with him. That would be so cool in terms of my father and his father, and the efforts that went on in the early '60s to that kind of
Now,
synergy.
we've got to educate him. I think he's got a lot of the right tendencies, but he really needs to get even deeper into the history of what's worked in the past for America. But of all the candidates out there right now, I think he's head and shoulders above them.
Are you taking a decent look, or have you yet, at Dr. Shiva?
No, I haven't.
Well, if you get a moment sometime, look into him. His stuff on health and understanding how we can beat these corporate monsters by being healthy, I think is worth a look.
I'll do that.
All right, Charlie Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. What a pleasure. Thank you so much, Harley, and I look forward to the next time.
See you in 2 weeks, John.
Okay, bye, everybody.